What new metrics in student success and in the enrollment funnel, the admissions funnel, should institutions be developing now? Or do you think it's more of the same?
I think the fundamentals are mostly the same. I don't know that all colleges always asking the right questions though, because we tend to think about this in pretty broad strokes, right? Like, what is your retention rate and what is your graduation rate at 4, 5, or 6 years? What's the average starting salary? What percentage of your students are getting jobs within 6 months of graduation? These are pretty well-known metrics, but maybe we ought to be digging a little bit deeper and saying, if we know that in the future, there's going to be a demand for more jobs in STEM fields in our market, then are we graduating enough students in those majors, looking back at like, what level of math are they getting to when they come to our institution? What does our curriculum look like? And are we able to bridge that difference? I just think that individual colleges all have to ask a different set of questions. Like, I can't tell if we're serving the public well in producing our graduates if I'm only using those really high level numbers.
Hello, humans. Welcome to the VineDown. I am joined this week by Heath Einstein, who's the Vice Provost for Enrollment Management at Texas Christian University. Heath, thank you so much for being on the show.
Emily, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, we don't know each other, though someone suggested you for the show. I said, who do you know that's good? And actually, Jay Jacobs and a couple of other folks said, like, you got to know Heath Einstein. I was like, well, I don't know Heath. So thank you for responding to be on the show. Heath, there are a bunch of things that I know that you and I are like exactly the same age. But when I have a guest on the show who I don't know, I typically cram to see if Ken Anselment has interviewed the person on the Alp. And thankfully, he had interviewed you. Your walkout song and my walkout song, my friend, are the same, which is Hunger Strike. Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. Banger.
Emily,
Yes.
I can't remember if I said this on the Alp, but when I was a first-year student in college, which would have been, I guess, roughly the same year that you were a first-year student in college, that was like my pre-party song. Like, if we were going out on the weekends,
It's an anthem.
It was an anthem. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, pretending I was Chris Cornell and or Eddie Vedder, depending on which part I was
Probably
doing.
both at the same time.
Yes,
Ideally.
ideally, and that just got me revved up, and still does to this day.
Okay, Heath, that was a fun entry to a potentially rough topic because what I want to talk to you about is sort of like navigating. Okay, don't know what word to filter in here, but the word unprecedented, the like confluence of all of this like political unrest and policy shifts that are happening right now. And it feels like we're sort of along another rocky precipice of like what we're going to do for enrollment management, what we're going to do to preserve diversity and access and equity in higher education. Like, a lot is happening right now. Subtitle, like, what the F do we do now? I'm really interested in talking with you about that. The thing that I actually want to start with, Heath, like, and I follow you on Twitter, and I want to ask you this really human question first, which is like, you're really invested in the news cycle in a deep way. Like, I don't know you, but this is what I perceive of you. You're like in it. And I know that you are a loud and long champion of, diversity and access in higher education. Question before we jump into the, like, what do we actually do? What is human you doing? How are you processing the changes emotionally as someone who's like dedicated your whole career to expanding access? Like, how are you caring for yourself in this moment?
I really appreciate you asking that question, Emily. And at the risk of deflecting, because I'm human just like anybody else, but I also recognize that I personally am going to be okay. Right. So, I mean, I have been to college, I have graduated, I have been to graduate school, I have entered the workforce, I have, made my way to a certain point on the career arc, and my life is fine. My life is great. I'm in fact quite blessed. And so while I do think about, obviously, myself and how to make sure I'm okay, I really am far more interested in how are we going to maintain a sense of opportunity for everybody else. Um, and maybe partly that's just because I'm naturally an optimistic person, and so I tend to think that um, that there, no matter what the climate is around us, there is opportunity for us to do better, to be better. And so I guess I don't have quite the same pessimistic outlook that or completely pessimistic outlook that some share, but I'm not naive either, and I know that these things don't just happen. That we need to activate um, these opportunities. And so we adapt. We try to pay attention to what's happening around us, and work within those systems and structures. But to answer your question, I gave you a long answer, but short answer is I'm fine. I'm lucky. I'm healthy. I've got a great family, and so I'll be okay.
Yeah, but, like, you're not I don't read that answer as deflecting. I actually view it as, like, a very smart way to, like, own your privilege and call your responsibility, not to say, like, it's not like, we're sitting here talking to each other as 2, like, presumably launched, presumably white humans. Like, yeah, you're right. Like, this is not for us. We are gonna be okay. I join you in that. And maybe then there's, like, sort of the foundational responsibility of, like, because personally we'll probably be okay, there's a responsibility to, like, do more for others and to sort of own more. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what what types of conversations are happening behind closed doors for you at TCU, for you among and sort of between your peers at other institutions that the public isn't hearing? Not like we have a huge public audience in our show, but what do you think is happening that is not quite out yet?
I think the first thing to recognize is that the political um, machinations don't exist in a vacuum. We're in the midst of a really challenging time for enrollment to begin with. So before we even get to this changing political landscape, um, we've got the so-called enrollment cliff that we're all dealing with. We have an erosion of trust in college writ large. Um, we have the um, skyrocketing sticker prices, which I'm quick to also point out doesn't always mean skyrocketing actual costs, because the net cost for per family hasn't moved in the same way that the sticker price has. But I don't think that that's covered by media particularly well. So the perception is certainly out there in the public that college is unaffordable. Um, we have shifting demographics that don't just occur evenly. So depending on what part of the country you're in and what the composition of your student body is, that's going to be um, uh, impacting what it looks like on the ground for you. Um, you have the changes that occur on a weekly basis, it seems, in intercollegiate athletics and what that means for some colleges. And I'm just naming a few things. Um, and those are, equally critical to the success of enrollment managers, as all the other stuff that's going on. So I want to start with that because I don't think we can just.
Like, times were rough going into it.
Right, exactly. Um, uh, so 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 then you add the layer on top of that of a new administration. You also have changes in some states in compositions of their legislatures or who's sitting in the governors and lieutenant governors chairs. Um, and I don't know that that gets a lot of attention on the national level. What happens in the states is relevant to what happens on college campuses. So we have to pay attention to all this stuff. And what's happening at TCU is we are in the midst of a brand new strategic plan, which is always fun. And I don't. That sounds tongue in cheek. We actually are really excited about this strategic plan. We have a relatively new president, Daniel Pullen, who was the dean of our Neely School of Business and has since been promoted to president within the last couple of years. And he is young and bold and audacious, and he brings with him an energy that inspires people. Um, and and so our board recently approved a new strategic plan, which is built on 4 pillars, one of which is student-centered growth. So we have enrollment growth in our sites, and that's really exciting. However, we have these headwinds that we're facing too. So our challenge is, how do we grow in an environment um, when when we have these headwinds, and when we know that the demographics of the country are shifting, and that some of the changes at a policy level might feel to some individuals or groups of individuals like it's an attack on them, um, right? So I think the conversations that we're having have a lot to do with um, marketing the university in a way that is values centered, um, and and mission critical, mission centered, so that our stakeholders and our prospective families understand that despite the political winds, which could um, move a flag one way or the other, it doesn't in any way jeopardize the ways in which we are anchored. And those anchoring values should be appealing to all students at all times, no matter what's going on in the world around them.
Yeah, I think there are 2 things that I'd pull out from that. One is, like, with all of the stacked cliffs and all of the deck stacked against us things that have been mounting over the last really 8 years, it feels like 5 years acutely, the last year super acutely. We've gotten a lot scrappier, right? Like, I would say in the first 10, 15 years of my career, like, things were more boring and things were more repeated, right? Like, we just ran the enrollment cycle year after year, and then things started changing. And I think of all of the things that have walled us in, like, what's happening now might just be another wall and makes the sort of the exit or the gap a little narrower, or makes the eye to thread a little narrower, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible. And I think, like, good, we've all faced some adversity in this business. Like, we've had to get a little more careful about the ways in which we do things. This is just another element to that carefulness, and maybe in that there's some freedom of, like, okay, within that, we're well prepared for this. We've innovated before. We can do this now. And I think, to return to some of the focus around, like, constituent management, right? So it's like, we got to keep the donors happy so we can keep the institution happy. And we got to keep the government happy, got to keep the students happy. And in this way, without being too broad and general, right? Like, because we can't go like all things to all people necessarily in the creation of our brand, right? So, like, it's just another element to solve for across that multidimensional set of axes.
Well, there are a lot of things you said there that we could dive into. One is, as I tend to be a reflective person. I like to look back and evaluate and think about, okay, well, what could we have done differently, or what was life like back when, and so forth. And so I always wonder, like, okay, was life easier? Was our work easier 10 or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, whenever you started, um, or were we not at a level where we were having to deal with these sorts of things? And I think the conclusion I've come to is, yes, it was easier. It wasn't just a function of us. Yeah. And the reason why I think that is because of the people that you and I know in this industry who are starting to throw their hands up, and they've been doing this a long time, and they're saying, I just can't do this anymore. Um, the challenge is too great and the payoff isn't big enough. So I do think ultimately we have some difficult times ahead of us. But I will say that, as we have, as an institution, gone around the country and spoken to our stakeholders, whether they are prospective students, alumni, donors, um, high school counselors, and the list goes on, they remain excited about the direction that the university is headed. So I do think, if there are other enrollment leaders who are listening to this conversation, um, being able to clearly establish what it is that distinguishes you in a crowded marketplace, and to sort of hit that full throttle is really important.
Yeah, I think that's right on. And I'm wondering if you were to sort of drill down into like your felt sense around how you view current students or the class that you've just admitted, like what are you currently worried about? How does that manifest? Like what are you currently looking at, thinking about that's kind of keeping you up at night?
Whenever asked, Whenever people ask me how do you sleep at night, I say I'm so exhausted from my days that I sleep really well.
That's
I
good.
did,
That's an adaptive set of behaviors.
I guess so. Yeah. I'm not one to just like my mind doesn't just wander for the entire night for the most part. Um, but what I do sort of quote unquote keeps me up at night, or does keep me thinking, is not so much how do we find students, or where do we find these students. We know where these students are. We know, I mean, there have been some changes in how we can do search, and but we all adapt. To me, it's more about over the last several years, particularly in light of COVID, where is the learning loss? How do we bridge that gap once these students get to our institutions? How are we making sure that they have the social capital to navigate these communities, especially as colleges continue to enroll first generation students who maybe don't understand the world of college because their parents can't pass that on to them. Um, and our job is to not just make sure these students graduate, but have um, that they have experiences that are similar across the board, so that we're not putting them into the world only to sort of go back to this bifurcated or stratified system. So those are the things that really I am paying even more attention to than ever before.
Well, for as long as I've been observing you, which is a number of years now,
That's not
you
creepy.
sorry,
No,
it's
no, no.
super creepy. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, okay, I'm owning it. I am like 100% that creepy. Well, like you're a person in enrollment. I've spent my life in enrollment. You're out there, you're on Twitter. But like one of the things that I've observed you say, like sooner than most people, is like, look, it is better for Earth if we have more diverse populations of students coming to our school. And we can't just address it in a short-sighted way, that you take this like long holistic view of like, okay, if we can't just buy more students to do the thing, we actually have to make sure that they're seeing themselves in our communities, that they are well supported. And now you're extending that to not even like, will you be well supported at our school, but also like, what are we doing to change culture so that by the time that you are out of our school, we're actually improving. It's like cycle improvements in the operating system of the world. Taking a much longer view, which is very cool to hear.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's something that we've been talking about at TCU for a long time. Um, this idea that college is um, one step in the engine of change, and so I think as we consider some of the challenges that we face right now with having to adapt in a new political environment, some of it is a recognition that it's linguistic, right? That there are terms, there are words that have um, become weaponized, um, when in fact, at a super high level, we I think a lot of us actually want the same thing, no matter what side of, and this is my optimism coming through, no matter what side of the political spectrum you might find yourself on. I think the goal is that as a society we improve, that we lift up everybody, that everyone has opportunity for education and for employment and for life success. How we do that, we have differences of opinion for sure. There's no question about it. But so when I say that I think college should be an engine for change, I don't think there's anything that's especially um,
Like divisive in that
problematic,
statement.
divisive,
Yeah.
controversial with that statement. Um,
Well, I
And
think you're
but
right. Like, I think it's not divisive, but I don't know that I like I don't know, it's tricky because I don't know that I actually agree with you that, like, we're all saying the same thing. Like, I'm now watching us say, like, really different things, and while I think I can agree with that statement, like, yeah, we college should be a vehicle for good. I think, like, yes, everyone would agree with you, but, like, I don't know anymore. Like, I don't think we all do want, like, opportunities for all people, and that feels really scary to me, but again, like, we won't get anywhere if I lean into that fear for myself.
right. And one of the things that I've tried to um, employ over the last few years, as we've seen, the SFFA decision come out and other things, is um, let's take the ruling at its word, but let's not try to do the work um, for others that might not actually be there. In other words, just to go back to a question you asked before with respect to like what are some of the conversations that they're having. I think colleges across the country are all having similar conversations, which boil down to something like, okay, how do we try not to have the target on our back, right? If there's going to be some future legislation, we don't want to be at the epicenter, and that's what's driving some of the decisions that you're seeing colleges make today. But I don't think it's colleges saying we now believe something different.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, and, like, my rule in this industry has long been, you're doing okay as long as you don't make the New York Times, right? Like, we make the New York Times in this industry when we really screw up. We admit we send out a bunch of emails admitting students that we didn't intend to admit. We have a data breach. We've broken a law, right? Like, these are now the things that will be exceptional enough that they are news, and we can stay organized by the same thing. But you're right, like, the principles sort of on first principles, colleges still should function to participate in the greater good, and that hasn't changed, right? It's just like, now how do we do that and maintain compliance in, amongst a lot of different change?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how do you then, as a leader in your institution, manage some of, like, the day-to-day interactions with your staff and the things that you need to do to, you're still recruiting the class. It's not like you've been able to just sort of hang it up and deal with the news. Like, you're bringing in a class, you're setting new strategy. Um, how do you do that when there's just a lot of chaos around you?
That's a great question. Um,
Figuring it
w-
out.
yeah, yeah, it's a daily task trying to figure that piece out. No, I think that well, one is I think any good leader, no matter what industry you're in, um, no matter what your work looks like on a daily basis, is going to have the quality of empathy. I think that's sort of non-negotiable because um, if people don't feel that you can relate to them, that you can step inside their shoes, they're not really gonna want to follow you. And so, on a one-on-one basis, on a sort of at that individual level, I just try to listen to people and hear their concerns, their fears, and then communicate. Um, I, I find that goes a pretty long way. Um, and so as I think about over the last few months or few years, and um, it's been a lot of those side conversations. Hey, how you doing? Okay, let me help you through this. Here's what I'm thinking. How can we join forces on this? Um, and just trying to allay people's concerns to the extent possible, right? Um, and then it's thinking about how the work that we're doing can sort of cut through the noise, right? Because some of the things that people have fear over um, may impact their lives outside of the job, but doesn't change necessarily the work they're doing day in and day out. In some cases, it does, and we have to talk through how we tailor um, objectives to continue to meet the needs of the university without ending up on the front page of the New York Times. To the point you made earlier. Um, but I mean, let's talk about for example, this idea of diversity. We know that in order to meet the mission of our institution, we have to have a marketplace of ideas. You've heard that term before. It's kind of hard to have a marketplace of ideas if everyone is coming from the same market, everyone's shopping at the same store. So there's nothing that's been put into law that says we can't try to bring together a group of students into our community who are reflective of the broad world around us. All we know from SFFA, for example, is how we are limited in how we construct that through the admission process. Right? So this goes back to what I was saying before, and this really comes from Art Coleman, someone whose work you know really well, which is don't do somebody else's job for them. Right? Don't make assumptions about what these rulings actually mean. Pay attention to what they're saying. And so we're trying to do that. And it goes back to what I was saying before about being being anchored in our values. I mean, TCU's core values are integrity, community, engagement, and excellence. There's nothing controversial about those words, right? So every decision we're making today and moving forward as it relates to our new strategic plan tied directly to that. But I don't think that we can be excellent if we don't have a marketplace of ideas.
Yeah. And just to like, I'm seeing your math here that I hope others are seeing too, which is like really clear strategy, drive behaviors, and make actions feel very straightforward. And I think there's you can very easily say, here are our core values, here's what we're trying to do strategically. And so I can get to downstream behaviors and actions that feel very directed by those strategies in the spirit of those strategies and in the spirit of those values. And I think sometimes at different layers of the institutions or at different types of institutions where strategy isn't clear or isn't clearly communicated or isn't trickling down clearly, what you're ended up with is a layer of, individual contributors, whether it's the admissions counselors, operating staff, or whoever, who like are agonizing about different decisions because they're not rooted up through that clear strategy. So like, just to slow that down, if you are a leader and you're like, oh, we haven't communicated our strategy and our strategy will make those behaviors super clearly, like, okay, get it together and do that, because then you will have a staff that can feel more empowered to actually do actions and do behaviors in service of those values. And I also don't want to lose what you said at the top of that, which is like things grounded in empathy feel really important in managing around chaos. And the skill that I think, took me some time to learn in my career was around validating without necessarily agreeing. And now is a great time to tote out that skill. You can make a person feel felt, you can make a group feel felt without necessarily agreeing. And a lot of the work, maybe like 90% of the get, is in that first validation, not necessarily that last 10% on sort of agreeing. Like they're not mutually exclusive. You don't actually have to agree in order to firmly validate. And you're right, like we're not lawyers or legislators, but you know what we are? We are class builders. And so let's pay attention to like not necessarily working to interpret the law, but just staying compliant in it and do what we do really well, which is build a class.
Yeah. And I have to say that I'm very fortunate to be at an institution that really does walk the walk. And that's not me tooting my own horn. That is me talking about TCU as a whole, and it starts with outstanding leadership. I mentioned President Pullen, who's been president for 2 years. We have a chancellor, Victor Bashini, who's been at TCU for 22 years, which is an incredibly long tenure for a university head. Having stability at the top of an organization and a very clear vision for where the university is headed is really important. Colleges that have instability are often the ones who are on shaky ground when it comes to their values, because what it suggests is there is a disconnect um, between the different layers of governance, whether that's board to president to academic leaders, or anywhere else in the organization. Um, so we're really fortunate in that way.
Okay, I have two questions, and this is a place where you may deploy. It's something you shared with me before we started recording is like, look, this is a show where we're definitely going to, kind of try to go there as much as possible, but there are some places that you will need to maintain like an awareness that you are under scrutiny as like a public figure, as an enrollment leader. Um, I'm curious if you will share with me, like, are you worried about data sources going away? Like, there was a very active LinkedIn conversation lately around like, what are we going to do if NCES, like iPads data or clearinghouse data, NCES data goes away? Are you preparing for that, or are you holding your optimism like, no, we're going to have access to the data that we need to do our jobs? What are you thinking there?
It's a good question. I'm not especially worried about that right now. I haven't given it enough thought, to be fully honest with you.
Weird. Have you been
Uh,
busy thinking about other things?
yeah, trying to bring in a class here, Emily. Um,
Right.
no, I
That.
we have pretty good analytical tools at our disposal that help us understand both ourselves and the market, such that the things that are being discussed at the moment don't um, provide me with existential concern.
I'm curious about how you think about your cohort of international students in the classes ahead. Is that something you've thought about, whether it's sort of bolstering the domestic population of students who are interested in TCU and good fits for TCU, or are you thinking about ways to maintain sort of cultural diversity from non-domestic students in the next couple of classes? What are you thinking there?
International students comprise usually between 3 and 4% of our undergraduate student body, which is pretty small compared to our peer and aspirant set of schools. And the reason for that for us is that, um, if you think about your international students, um, from an enrollment management standpoint, they tend to fall into one of two categories. Either they are a tremendous revenue source because you are popular and you have a particular position in the market, and you're desirable to the point where people are willing to pay whatever it takes to go there, or they are a revenue drain. That is, you have to discount heavily in order to get students to come to your school. We think that international students bring such a critically important cultural dimension to our student body that we have been willing to invest and in them. But we have a budget model that really prevents us from going too far ahead of where we are right now, unless we can change the position in the market. So we've been spending our time over the last couple of years thinking about the ways in which we can do that. Now, what's interesting is, given the current political climate, what are international students going to do? We're starting to hear, and I'm hearing this from my colleagues at other institutions, that there is some erosion from students in certain parts of the world, and they've got opportunities to go to other countries, sometimes in a much more affordable way, sometimes requiring fewer years in college. If you think about the UK, and so they might eschew the U.S. Colleges. And if that's the case, well, I guess we're no worse off because we don't rely on them as heavily as some other schools do. But we are starting to think really seriously about markets that we haven't been as active in previously, and how do we reposition ourselves in those markets?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to go back to what we were talking about when I had asked about Like, are you worried about data sources going away? And I'm wondering what like what new metrics for success in student success and in the enrollment funnel, the admissions funnel, should institutions be developing now, or do you think it's more of the same? Like, and by more of the same, I mean the advice that you and I would give anybody, right? Like get your CRM data clean, make sure that you're, analyzing and understanding past behaviors of past classes to understand where you are currently year to date. Like, do you think there are new indicators that we should be watching in this day and age as we develop our understanding of how to recruit well and how to keep students successful?
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything new that's emerging, or do you think it's just like the fundamentals are still the same? We just need a clean perspective on them.
I think the fundamentals are mostly the same. I don't know that all colleges are always asking the right questions, though, because we tend to think about this in pretty broad strokes, right? Like, what is your retention rate and what is your graduation rate at 4, 5, or 6 years? What's the average starting salary? What percentage of your students are getting jobs within 6 months of graduation? These are pretty well-known metrics. But maybe we ought to be digging a little bit deeper, and saying, okay, well, if we know that in the future there's going to be a demand for more jobs in STEM fields in our market, then are we graduating enough students in those majors? And then, but looking back at, like, what level of math are they getting to when they come to our institution, and what does our curriculum look like, and are we able to bridge that difference, particularly in light of what we were speaking about before with learning loss? I just think that individual colleges all have to ask a different set of questions, and so yes, there needs to be some common language there, but that's not going deep enough. Like, I can't tell if we're serving the public well in producing our graduates if I'm only using those really high level numbers.
Well, higher ed isn't a corporation. And in a corporation, you would have like a product manager or a product owner who would create the product that you're making. It'd be based on data. Like, I think enrollment is really good at understanding some of those like top level metrics to understand, like, okay, now how do we position ourselves against, and how do we communicate some of the things that make our institution great, whether it's statistics on graduation rates or student success or outcomes and job placement. But then having those set of things, like, I think enrollment could teach the rest of the institution how to make meaning out of that top layer of things, because we're really good in enrollment at communicating that out, like turning that into the brand, turning that into the positioning statements, turning that into our trifold search piece. Like, we're really good at that. But where I think it stops at institutions is like, okay, now we need to push that into the level of like what it means for the product of higher education. Will we actually change majors? Would we shut a program down if it wasn't relevant anymore? Would we modify the way that we deliver courses and credentials to create a more flexible operating system? Like, that's where I think the rest of institutions could learn from what we do really well in enrollment, which is like market and speak around those things. But like, how does it and when does it go deep enough to impact the product of a college education?
I think that's a really good point, Emily. And I think there are colleges out there that do that successfully, where their enrollment
It's
teams.
hard.
It's really hard. If you've got a good institutional research office, and they have a relationship with academic deans and provosts and so forth, and so they're not just like spitting out information, but they're actually helping to strategize. That's really important. And as you were talking about that, it made me think, and I know this is moving in a slightly different direction, but I was thinking about how we so often lament about what the colleges are doing, right? Like, why are colleges not moving off of a certain deadline, or why are the colleges behaving this way. And what I don't think most people really appreciate, even if they understand it on an intellectual level, is that we are all independent actors.
Yes.
Like there is no such thing as the colleges. There is
It's not a
TCU, and
monolith.
it's not a
Yep.
monolith. I certainly pay really close attention to what our peers are doing, and I have lots of conversations with my counterparts at other institutions, and that might in part shape how I think about things, or maybe changes that we make. But there's not a governing body that is saying you, the colleges, have to do certain things, right? In fact, the Department of Justice has worked really hard to make sure we don't act as a monolith.
That's right. Well, um, even small things like sort of NACAC becoming more of a, networking body rather than a governing body, and that's now years old. But like, yeah, I mean, colleges can and do act independently. And there's a spectrum of sort of like maturity to locate different colleges on who are more and less able to be informed, like create product strategy essentially informed by, a strategic IR group versus just like one that's just sort of trying to keep up reactively. Okay, Heath, at the top I said like it's unprecedented times again. Do you think there's anything that's happened in our like over the length of our careers that we can lean on and learn from in this moment, or do you think it's truly like, yeah, we're rough and tumble, we got this, keep going?
We have faced crises before. Um, and every crisis in the moment feels like it's the worst thing that's ever happened. But like my career started in admissions 1 month before September 11th. And that changed the world. And I mean, for a very short period, at least, it also like very much changed. Like, okay, what were we going to do in admissions? Like, people were stranded, and but but these things happen, right? We experienced COVID. Look at how Tulane adapted and other schools in New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. I mean, so we have experienced this either individually or as an industry before. And I think we have learned how to become adaptable. So I don't know that there's like one specific lesson that we can carry with us, other than I think ultimately the value proposition of higher education remains. And we can prove that in a number of different ways. It's our job to do just that, to continue to convince the market that there is a reason why not only that we exist, but that lives will be better, and people will thrive as a result of being part of this enterprise that we call higher ed. But I am optimistic about where we're headed, despite everything.
Despite it all. Well, Pollyanna himself, Heath Einstein, thank you for being on the show today. I really appreciate you being here and sharing with me as candidly as you can. Humans, go take care of yourself. Thank you. We'll see you next time.